Thanks a lot, Dave. Let's see if I can figure this out. Yeah, it's great to be here. This is a very important subject which doesn't always receive the attention that it deserves, unfortunately. If you think about a function like sales or marketing or product development, when they do a great job, you see this big splash of a product launch or close that big deal. It's very visible what that accomplishment is. When somebody who's managing supplier risk and compliance does a great job, then nothing goes wrong. And it's not so much in the forefront necessarily of the executives. So this is actually a challenge to understand why this for the senior executive level, to understand why these functions are so important, except for those cases where they know they're going to go to jail. They kind of understand those a little better. But we're going to talk a little about how you get the proper level of investment here, which today, frankly, is lacking. So I'm going to talk, first of all, what we mean at ChainLink when we talk about supplier risk and compliance and why it's becoming so important, and then go through some research findings. We've done several surveys of hundreds of different companies, and we'll talk to you about what we learned in those. And then finally, this kind of roadmap to how we can address these issues and get better at these functions. It goes without saying the world is a messy and dangerous place. When we look at managing supplier risk, we naturally tend to focus first on the supplier themselves, and are they financially viable? Are they coming through for us in terms of what they're supposed to deliver, etc. But there are so many other things that can go wrong, especially when you have giving confidential IP overseas. That could get stolen. If they're a manufacturer, is their factory in an earthquake zone? Are they subject to perhaps giving bribes? And you want to know if they're going to ruin your reputation because they're breaking some laws around child labor or environmental factors, IT security breaches. The list kind of goes on in here, and I'm not going to go through them all. The point is that there's a very broad range of risks that you really need to consider, usually with limited resources. And so that's the challenge that I want to talk about today. And on this slide, I'm breaking up into very kind of neat categories of risk and compliance as two separate functions. In fact, there are overlaps and linkages between the two functions. Supplier risk we can think of as looking at the financial risks, not just is my supplier financially sound, but are they potentially going to cause me other financial damage through theft. Exchange rates can be a big problem, and operational issues. So is my supplier performing, but also they may be subject to shortages, their own operations, how secure is their own IT, and things like that. And then geographic-based issues. This could be around natural disasters, or especially if you're a manufacturer, do you have an over-concentration of suppliers, not just your first tier, but in tier 2 and 3. And this is something we learned in a big way when the tsunami hit. A lot of people got hammered by tier 2 or tier 3 breakdowns in their supply chain. And reputational, of course, very important, especially for brand companies that sell to consumers. They've discovered the hard way that their entire supply chain, they're responsible in the court of public opinion for the behavior of that supply chain. When we talk about compliance, you can really break it up into kind of two big buckets here. One is the compliance manual that describe the behavior that you expect of your suppliers. And this is the operational behaviors so that you can work smoothly with them, social responsibility that they must take, and financial standards that you expect them to meet. Then there's all the external compliance requirements. Depending on your industry, these may be heavier in pharmaceutical or aerospace, but everybody has to face these regulations around governance, environmental, and labor and working conditions. And these corporate standards that you give to your suppliers, a lot of them are designed to address these issues of risk and compliance. So there's a lot of linkages here in this type of framework. Now this is, the question is, whose job is this, right? And people tend to think of a couple functions: procurement, risk management, and compliance. So to start off, you've got those three different functions that are responsible. But then beyond that, you've also got other groups in your organization that need to be involved. The IT group, which is going to help integrate suppliers and needs to understand also if they're protecting your confidential data. Your legal group, drawing up the contracts for to make sure that you're protected. Quality assurance, supply chain management. The point here is that it really takes a cross-functional team to do this well, and that's one of the probably biggest weaknesses, is that these functions don't always talk to each other. So how do you get the risk management to really be done across the whole organization? Now this view, one of the questions is, why has supplier risk and supplier compliance become so important? And I'm showing you a somewhat manufacturing-centric view, but it applies across other industries as well. And that's this change in business models. So I used to work for computer companies many years ago that did everything themselves. We built our own chips, our own disk drives, had our own operating system. Nobody does that anymore. It's now broken up into literally many dozens of layers of companies that it takes to bring these products to market. So all of that before you had all of the risks that you were controlling within your company. That's now in your supply base, and so it becomes very important to manage that risk. And we like to say success comes from managing the links in the chain. That's actually my company, ChainLink Research. We were founded because we felt like that was where the real focus needs to be, on these relationships. So another way to look at it is, we've become more global. We've become extremely tiered. So it's no longer just about one or two tiers of suppliers. You probably have dozens to get back to your raw materials if you're a manufacturing or retail company. And we've taken inventory out of the chain, out of the supply chain. So when something breaks, it hurts sooner and it hurts a lot more. And this was really driven home by this study by Vinod Singhal, a good friend of our firms down at Georgia Tech. What he did, he had the advantage of having, we like to call it the slave labor of the students who will work for free, and had them comb through articles to find almost 1,000 headlines that announced a supply chain disruption. So this was something where the product couldn't ship because they couldn't get enough parts, or there were engineering problems. Whatever it was, their supply chain had a major disruption that was big enough to make it into the newspaper as a headline. And he said, what happened to the stock price of those companies starting 1 year before to 1 year after the day of the announcement? What he found is that it dropped on average 25%. And worse yet, it stayed down at that depressed level for a full year before it started to climb back up. So here you have, and by the way, this is during the 90s when the stock market on average is going up 11% per year. So you're at over 35% delta from your peers as a result of a single supply chain disruption. Now, if that doesn't get the CEO's attention, I'm not sure what will. The same study went through the impact on operating income, return on sales, return on assets, sales, cost, assets, and inventory. I won't go through these numbers, just to say across the board, these incidents can have a tremendous negative impact. And so we know that supply chain and supplier risk is a very critical issue. I want to switch a little bit and talk about compliance and how the compliance has also grown in importance over years, and it's going to continue to grow. Starting with your own corporate standards that you expect your suppliers to meet. So this is my rendition of what compliance manual used to look like many decades ago. Those of you with gray hair may remember that it was a very simple set of instructions and a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but not much tongue-in-cheek. Get out your hernia belt. And it's worse than this because they're electronic, so they can make them as big as they want today. And what the heck is in that is everything about how we want our suppliers to behave, how we want them to package the things that they're sending us. what type of cartons and pallets they should be put on. That barcode should be 3 inches down and 5 inches over. It's got to be there for my automated handling equipment to read it. Otherwise, I can't handle it. What freight you should use, what documentation's got to go with it, how I should be invoiced. If something goes wrong, how am I going to return it? How am I going to integrate with the systems with you? And I want to make sure that your systems are secure because I'm giving you confidential information. I want to make sure you're protecting my IP. And also, if your systems go down, you can no longer deliver to me, so I want to see your disaster recovery plan. Your insurance coverage has got to be there. I want to make sure you're meeting all the labor and environmental standards. And, of course, when you mess up, I'm going to fine you, right? And if you're in manufacturing or retail, it's a fine per incident, and those can really add up. And you're going to disagree that you messed up, so there's got to be a process for resolving those disputes. Anyone who's in compliance can probably come to me and say, oh, you forgot this, 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 and this in this list, right? The point is, these are becoming very comprehensive descriptions of how we want the supplier to behave. And it's not just because we're control freaks. Companies do this because, if you go back to that picture, a lot of what's happening is now outside of your company. You want that interface to operate very efficiently, like a high-performance machine between you and your supplier. Efficient supply chain, you want your systems integrated, you want your IP protected, and so forth. And so we expect this trend of increasingly complex and sophisticated supplier compliance requirements just to increase. There's a similar story, but in a very different way when you look at the external requirements, the regulations that are regulatory requirements that are placed on companies. And I know businesses complain all the time about the regulatory burden, but the truth is, get used to it. It's only going to get worse, right? If you look over the broad sweep of history, it used to be nothing was regulated. Like anybody could do anything, just about. And events would happen, and especially with the advent of modern media, things like Upton Sinclair's Writing the Jungle, or more recently the Enron scandal or the subprime mortgage crisis. These are trigger events that the public gets outraged about, and our lawmakers feel compelled to try to do something to make sure nobody ever does that again, right? And this pile of regulations never shrinks. It only grows. So this is not meant to be a depressing part of the talk, but just to say this is another ever-growing and ever in importance for companies. And if you get it wrong, the consequences are huge to your brand reputation, to your customers' trust, and to tens of millions of dollars, even hundreds of millions of dollars in fines. So I think we can make the case that this is a very important function. The question is, how much attention is it getting, at what level, and what type of investment? That's just one of the types of research questions we ask. I'm going to go through that and talk about some other areas of research as well. So we wanted to find out, now this was focused specifically on the reviewing of a supply chain risk and what level in your company is that reviewed at, supply chain and supplier risk. As you can see, for the majority of companies, it's at either the individual contributor level or the functional executive. This is the VP of supply chain, VP of procurement, VP of logistics. Only about 20% of the cases is it at the business unit executive or at the corporate executive level. And we found this 80-20 pattern to happen over and over again, that 80% of the companies thought this function belonged down in the bowels of the organization, and about 20% said, hey, this is really strategic. Top management's got to pay attention to this. And it shows in many different ways. And this was, when we do these surveys, we try to design the numbers so we'll get a nice bell curve, right? That's our objective. As you can see, we guessed wrong on this one. And this was a question about how much do you spend per year on assessing and auditing your suppliers and your supplier risk, and wanted a total cost number, your internal labor, your systems, external services, everything. And we were frankly shocked at how low the levels of investments are. So I think it's clear that this is an area that is underinvested in unfortunately, today. And again, I think that's changing, but slowly. We asked if companies consider supplier risk when they select the supplier. And it turns out almost 90% of companies do. It's either mandatory or it's optional, but they do most of the time. Only about 10% don't. And that doesn't tell the whole story. When you drill down a little into how they, like this particular question was, you expect your suppliers to have a certain level of risk management themselves. Do you specify that? And less than 30% said they have a published set of risk mitigation standards for their suppliers. So even though the compliance manual is getting thicker, this is one area that maybe hasn't caught up yet. We asked another question about assessing risk for suppliers. And this was, how often do you assess risk based on the criticality of the suppliers? We broke it into critical, important, and everyone else. And what we found was that about 60% of the companies said that they assess the risk and audit their critical suppliers at least once a year. So that other 40%, you have to wonder if this supplier is truly critical and your business is going to stop if they stop delivering to you, then how come you're not at least trying to audit the risks there? We also wanted to find out, what do you mean by a critical supplier, and what type of risk factors do you typically look at? So critical, the obvious definition is if they stop shipping to me or providing their service to me, I stop, right? I can no longer ship product, or I can no longer run my company. But there's another aspect to it, which is, and it's difficult for me to switch over to someone else. Either there are few alternatives, there's a high cost of switching, or I've built this very intricate set of relationships either through IT or just human to human that it's very hard to duplicate. That makes a supplier critical. And risk factors, this mirrors in somewhat that world is a messy diagram I started out with. You know, these are some of the things you might look at. Is there another supplier around who can do what this supplier does? Are they in good financial condition? Quality is something that is a predicting or leading indicator, so it tends to go bad before their financial numbers start to go bad. It's a good thing to pay attention to. Plant locations, of course, and switching costs we just talked about. Came across some interesting ones like relative power in the relationship. This was a small electronics company that said that they were nervous about doing business with someone like Intel because they would just get lost in the noise when there were shortages against, say, an HP and a Dell, and they'd rather deal with a company where they could get some more attention. So there are a lot of different factors that companies may consider. In fact, one of the issues is that there are so many things to look at, and we have limited resources. So how can we consider use those resources most wisely? And you know, partly it comes down to prioritizing, simplifying, and focusing on the things you really need to know, and leveraging third-party information and services. And I'm going to get back to that last point because I think it's really important. That's actually how I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to switch gears here a little and talk about compliance. Now, this was a fairly specific study. We surveyed about 120 retailers, and we surveyed their suppliers and asked the same question about compliance of both the retailers and their suppliers. So the answers the retailers gave are in blue, and the answers the supplier gave are in red. And we wanted to know, so this is largely about the operational part of compliance, like putting the label in the right place, not stacking your pallets too high, those kinds of things. We asked, what was the impact on the retailer's operational costs of these programs? Do you think that they were realizing any savings in their own operations? And the suppliers really kind of were all over the map, so maybe didn't really understand that. But the retailers tended to fall into two buckets. This one that said 0.5% to 2% of savings or no impact. And 0.5% to 2% of savings, that's really significant because most of that is falling to your bottom line. These, you know, minus the cost of implementing the program. But that's really a pretty substantial benefit from these programs. those who have no impact, you got to ask, why are they doing this program if it's not helping them run their company more smoothly? And we got a comment about that in a minute. This is the same question flipped to the other side. What does this do to suppliers' costs? The fact that the supplier now has to do some very specific things all along the way just for you, Mr. Customer. And, you know, the answer is that the retailers tended to greatly underestimate the actual cost, burden they were putting on suppliers. They either thought there was no cost or just a very tiny one. And suppliers said, nope, you know, it's a substantial burden. So in a sense, these programs are a transfer of cost from your retailer to your supplier. Your supplier now has to deal with very unique relationships per retailer in packaging, labeling, loading sequence, and everything they do. And on the retailer side, they get things that can flow through their system smoothly, get onto the retail floor easily, etc. And, you know, not everybody thought about it this way, but that's kind of what we uncovered. Part of that is reduction in retailers' cycle times, greater efficiencies. So as part of that research, we also wanted to find out from both sides, how do you run these programs better? How can you improve your compliance program? Or for supplier, how do you deal with this, dealing with all these different demands placed by 100 different customers? We found for those who weren't getting results for their compliance program, a lot of time it was actually lack of enforcement, lack of visibility, and lack of feedback to their suppliers. So vigilance and monitoring and striving for 100% is kind of the first sort of base level thing that we found that people should do. And this next one, again, it's more for a company that moves physical goods, and it has to do with direct communications between the operations group. So instead of just mandating this is where you put the label, you bring the person in who's responsible for shipping, you bring them into your DC and show them, here's how our equipment works. If your label's in the wrong place, it gets shunted over to the side there to be handled manually and gets delayed for hours, right? Or if you stack your pallets too high and show them a bunch of crushed boxes, this is what happens to them. And that type of sort of direct communication, which becomes more of a collaborative effort now about how to operate together better, we found that companies that did that got better results from their compliance program than just the thou shalt approach. On the supplier side, some suppliers have to get used to dealing with very fine-grained and specific demands from multiple customers. So we found that suppliers who were successful at that were actually designing their systems and processes to get better at that, like fast changeovers so that they could do small runs of very specific types of packaging and labeling, optimizing their systems, using third parties, because sometimes 3PLs and third-party logistics organizations and others are better and can provide great flexibility at this kind of thing. One more thing we asked in our survey was about managing across multiple tiers. This is an issue, as I mentioned, that sort of came to the forefront in the tsunami and, for that matter, in the Thailand floods, where companies' production actually was reduced or halted, not because of their immediate suppliers, but because of something that happened down 2 or 3 tiers down the road. And so it's still the case, and I think this is an accurate one, that almost 80% of companies don't manage risk across multiple tiers. They say, we manage our immediate supply base, and it's their job to manage their risks, not ours. But that approach can come back to bite you. It's not cheap to do this, so it has to be on a very selective and targeted basis. But we found some of the best companies are doing different flavors of that, which we can talk about when we have more time. The last slide I'm going to show you for the research results is this was a self-assessment on how you're doing at managing supplier risk. And it's probably not readable because the print's small, but pay attention to the colors here. The dark green means we're doing very good. The light green means good. Yellow means fair, and red means poor. And the gray, the brown, this is specifically about how good is your supply chain group doing at managing risk. Brown means it's not supply chain's responsibility, so I'm not going to give you an answer. But the point here is that there's more yellow and red than there is green and dark green, a fair amount more. In fact, only the top 2 cases did more than 50% of the companies say, hey, we're doing at least good at managing risk. And I think this just reinforces the A is the low-level investment, but B, this is actually a fairly new discipline. 10 years ago, people weren't talking about supply chain risk. They were talking about lean and going to China, right? I mean, that's where the focus was. And so companies are still learning how to manage these types of risks. So given we know this is a very important function with huge consequences if you get it wrong, and that we're only doing a mediocre job at it today in many cases, let's talk about what a roadmap to success would look like. What are some of the better companies doing? This is an incident-driven priority. What do I mean by that? I mean that the CEO, he or she is paying attention to sales, launching new products, going to new markets, controlling costs, right? And hoping that the organization is taking care of the risks. That's generally the mindset, except for when something goes wrong. Now all of a sudden it's important and everybody's running around. And my point is human nature is not going to change, so just take advantage of those incidents, obviously not in the middle of the crisis. You have to solve the crisis, let things calm down. But while it's still fresh in people's mind, that's when you have to continue to build the case for investment. And the cross-functional support is very important. We sometimes run these workshops where we'll tell people, bring the risk manager and bring the supply chain manager from your company to this workshop together, because we want the supply chain or procurement people and the risk manager to both be in solving these problems. And it's amazing how often those people either have never met or just kind of know that each other exists but never work together. And so the point is, if you're in one of these functions like risk management or supplier management or compliance, to the extent that you could start to be the person that brings these cross-functional integration, it'll help your company a lot. Establishing metrics is important to know if you succeeded and also to show that your function has some value. In these functions, a lot of time it has to do with what did you avoid, what damage did you avoid. So, number of incidents per year might be one type of metric, or how fast you recovered versus your peers from some disaster, those types of things. Of course, you've got to prioritize with limited resources. This is kind of like motherhood and apple pie, but it's even more important in this area, which tends to be underinvested in, to pick your battles wisely. I'm going to actually spend my last slide after this one on why it's so important to leverage third-party services and solutions, but certainly that's a key piece to how you get the most bang for your buck out of limited resources. Once you're making progress, show progress so you can get continued investment. This one I just want to spend a second because this is really important. A lot of times this knowledge tends to be encaged in pockets. So somebody knows something, but it's not making its way across the enterprise. So it's very important to institutionalize so that within your processes and within your policies, this knowledge is baked in and that you're able to do a better job day to day, and so that when a person leaves, all of that knowledge doesn't leave, and you've actually improved the way you operate as a company, and it becomes part of the culture. And champion the cause at every opportunity. That's the only way to raise the visibility. I know that people who manage risk and compliance tend not to be the marketing type, right? The type to get up on the soapbox and say, rah, 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 this is so important. But you have to kind of do that and overcome what you're comfortable with to get support. So as I said, I'm going to focus on why it's important to leverage services and solutions. The most obvious reason is that it's a lot of work to collect all these surveys manually and collect this information manually, and you make errors. So saving labor is one thing, but perhaps even more important, companies who focus on this area have spent, a decade or more building in intellectual property and knowledge about, what should be in a different type of survey, what should a program look like, and you want to take advantage of, and also the knowledge about suppliers, a whole database about suppliers. You want to take advantage of that built-in knowledge that you can get from these services and solutions. And they help you to, I talked about institutionalizing, they help you to embed this risk and compliance into your everyday processes. So this is really important. You want it just to be part of how you do business. When you bring a supplier on board, technology can ask the right questions so that you know which surveys that supplier should fill out automatically. They come automatically. You track whether they were completed or not, and the little tickler goes out, and all of those things. If you can build them into all your processes, it just makes you run that much more efficiently, and you're sure to not let things slip through the cracks. Another thing these tools do, there's so much data out there that you need to look at to say where is something going wrong. They can do the monitoring for you so you can manage by exception. Raise the red flag. Hey, maybe you should be paying attention to this supplier. Give you some type of early warning that something's going wrong. And that's incredibly valuable. As well as mining for data across patterns, mining for patterns across this huge amount of data. The programs that you put in place when you find something wrong, these types of systems will help you usually with a template and with some type of workflow to make sure that things are getting done. So they can help you manage these projects and programs, and overall lower cost. And the final point, as I said, which I think is really important, is institutionalizing the knowledge so that as you start making these improvements, and if you're building them into a database and into a workflow and into your processes, they're becoming baked into your company. And so this solutions really can help in that type of approach. And let's see if I can. So I'd like to open up for questions. I will point out, by the way, if you're interested in some of the studies we've done, first of all, I'd be happy to send you a copy if you give me your card or send me an email. My address is up there. You can also look on our website, chainlinkresearch.com/risk. There's a whole library of research there that might have some good resources for you. Do we have time for questions? I think we got a few minutes. Any questions, either here or from the people on the phone? Yes.
Speak to the audience for the survey, or the characteristics of responding company size, and
Okay. So the question was, what were the demographics of the companies in the surveys? There are actually two different surveys I was mixing and matching from there. One was the retailer supplier one I mentioned, and the other was a more general supplier risk survey. The retailer supplier, there was about 120 retailers and somewhat more than that number of suppliers. And they were a cross-section of the sizes, a normal distribution of the size of companies. As far as that. In the other one was about 150 companies, and the same thing. It was across company sizes. So that's why when you saw, for example, that spend number, there were a number of small companies in there, but there were also large companies as well. That's why I expected more of a distributed sort of bell curve in that number. And that the risk study was across industries, with less focus on service industry, though more on manufacturing, distribution, and retail industries. Any other questions? Yes?
Your slide, who's minding the store?
Yes.
And then you also mentioned getting risk and this and the sourcing manager together.
Yes.
So who do you see taking the lead on that, of coordinating and managing?
Yeah. That's a great question. The question was, since some of these issues are very cross-functional, so who should be taking the lead, which function? And you know, the right answer is probably whoever's got the guts to do it. It could come from the sourcing and procurement or the supply chain group. Supply chain group in particular tends to, now this would be a different answer for a service company, right? We're a supply chain research firm, so we tend to deal more with manufacturers, distributors, and retailers. And supply chain group is already a cross-functional, tends to be a cross-functional type of function because they deal with procurement folks, they deal with engineering, they deal with manufacturing. So it's kind of a natural fit for them. The risk manager, it's more front and center in terms of their responsibility.